Welcome to the 60th African History Month, organized by the Global Pan-Africanism Network, closed bracket, GPAN. Before I start my keynote speech, I would like all of us to observe a moment of silence in honor of the Dr. Joseph John Pombe Magufuli, late President of the Republic of Tanzania, who died on March 17th, 2021, together with our beloved sister, Annie Nira, Radio 54, presenter who promoted the program called Panorama. She also died in South Africa recently. Join me in paying our last respect to the departed souls of our beloved son and the daughter of Africa. Thank you very much. The guest of honor and founder of African History Month, and also the founder and president of Global Pan-Africanism Network, closed bracket, GPAN, as well as the President of the United States of Africa, Yusuf, His Excellency, Mr. Daniel Mashumbi Mwambonu, State Council. GPAN country representatives, both in Africa and in the diaspora. Great heroes and heroines of African descent all over the world. Fellow people of African descent with disabilities all over the world. Leaders of various disabled persons organizations, closed bracket, GPO, DPOs, invited leaders of various NGOs and political parties, if any, members of the press, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with my singular honor and privilege to be part of this gallant and auspicious occasion to commemorate this 60th African History Month conference and celebrate the achievements of people of African descent with disabilities and acknowledge their enormous contribution. That Africa has made to the world's civilization under the theme, the Holocaust, MAAFA, close the bracket, remembrance of the victims of transatlantic, the Indian Ocean, and trans-Saharan slave trade. The 60th International African History Month of the Holocaust, of the victims of the slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which we are commemorating, took place on the 26th March 2021. Mr. President, I wish to thank the members of the Executive Committee of GPAN for extending invitation for me to speak today at the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, termed the MAAFA, which is Kiswahili for the Great Tragedy, or what men descendants of enslaved Africans call the African Holocaust. The Middle Passage was the stage of the triangular trade in which millions of enslaved Africans, mainly from West Central, and Eastern Africa, were shipped to the New World as a part of the Atlantic slave trade voyage. On the Middle Passage, were a large financial undertaking, and they were generally organized by companies or groups of investors, and in many cases, countries, traders from the Americas and the Caribbean received the enslaved Africans, and the Caribbean Africans, I read that one, the enslaved Africans, European powers such as Portugal, England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the Sweden, as well as traders in the Caribbean, South America, and of course, North America, took part in this trade. The enslaved Africans came mostly from 8 regions: Senegal, Upper Guinea, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, and Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, and Southeastern Africa. We know This because this forced kidnapping and free labor was a business, and like most businesses, records were kept, and at least during the period when it was legal until the mid 1800s, we have much to thank from all the historians, economists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and geneticists such as myself, who have studied the history and consequences of the transatlantic slave trade across the African diaspora. I look forward to working with the new generation of young scientists and historians who will advance knowledge and research on the transatlantic slave trade so that millions of the descendants of the enslaved recognize that their history did not start with slavery on some plantations in the antebellum South. The education system is partly to blame for this tragedy, where our youth actually believe that their history started with slavery. When I got to middle schools and high schools in around the country to talk with our youth, I can see in their eyes the discomfort and the pain when discussion lead to slavery. If this is the only time they see themselves in the history books, it is no wonder they are not excited about the school systems. So we have to educate and let them know that their history did not start with slavery, but that our ancestors went through that period. They must know that they are the descendants of proud, take note, of proud, productive, and purposive people who have resisted and survived the worst Holocaust in the history of the world. It is this history that ties or connects Africans in the diaspora, whether it is the Gula or Guche people in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, or the Afro-Brazilian. They are each bound to this shared history, just as the Mendes rice planters from the upper coast of West Africa, now called Sierra Leone, and the Imbengala from Angola were shackled as they were marched to their coasts and placed in holding cells in forts to wait the ships for the mid passage. The shackles, the binding, the shared experience is what has brought us all here today. The tie that binds, it connects people in one of the greatest connections of this planet. Take note of that. The African continent. The African continent is rich in mineral resources and also cultural and biological diversity, but also one that historically, because of biology and geography, its inhabitants were labeled inferior and then enslaved. This tie binds shared cultures. One horrible feature of the transatlantic slave trade was the attempt by the enslavers to purge the West African traditions and cultures of the enslaved. In light of their attempts to eradicate the transmission of cultural knowledge of the enslaved to the next generation, there are still remnants, take note of that, remnants of West African culture and the languages in the Americas. The shared cultures across the diaspora served as a beacon, alerting lost descendants to homes unknown. African Americans and Africans in the diaspora in the New World have had a unique population history shared by no other group on the planet. This unique history was predicated on the loss of family ties and cultural ties and dehumanization. Interestingly, it is what binds us in terms of humanity that allows us to infer family history and ancestry. By that I mean DNA, the genetic material that is in every cell of our body. We inherit this genetic material, cell or DNA, from both of our parents. 50% from our mother and 50% from our father. Our grandparents inherited from their parents and great-grandparents and so on. This chain is like a hierarchy in nature. It links us to one family, links us to a community. DNA links us to regions on the continents. And it is because of this DNA, this genetic material, that we pass on to our children that could not be removed like languages, were, could not be lost like cultures and traditions were. This DNA resisted and survived, and so when we look at the genetics of African people, in the diaspora, we see the genetics of Mende people, of Timne, of Kru, of Kepele, of Massa, of MAAFA, of Akan, the Akwi, the Mandinka, the Wolof in their genetic material, because that material has not changed and has not been lost. And it is because of the huge amount of African genetic diversity that we are able to do this. Humanity started in Africa. Take note of that one. Humanity started in Africa. I don't think I need to tell you all. Scientists have proven that humanity started in Africa. Modern human populations have been in Africa for a long time, over 150,000 years ago. Enough time for high levels of variation to occur in the DNA of African peoples. We use this genetic information to seek ancestry for the descendants of the enslaved Africans throughout the diaspora. As I mentioned, Africa is a continent with rich natural resources, but also biological resources. This richness in biology calls for survival and resistance in the face of harsh treatment and racism during the transatlantic slave trade. It is also the rich variation that produces diversity in the physical features. Disease resistance and health scientists have estimated that somewhere between 15 to 30% of the enslaved Africans did not make it across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage. That is a very high mortality rate. Mortality rates may have been considerably higher within Africa itself due to the process of capturing and transporting the enslaved to the ships. Many died at sea, mainly due to infectious diseases or lack of food and water. We need to explore this because the current state of health among Africans in the diaspora is poor. We must focus attention on health disparities. Take note of that. Health disparities, and it should be a focus at the international level, given its impact among people of African descent. When we look at the common complex diseases like type 2 diabetes, asthma, cancer, heart disease, hypertension, they are all linked to genes and the environment. Health disparities must be seen as an issue of social justice alongside the issue of reparations. I have been blessed to work with a group called African Ancestry, where we use and leverage DNA to trace the ancestry and the descendants of enslaved Africans to connect them to their lost homeland. Our service created enormous excitement among African Americans. It changes the psyche of many African Americans when they are successful, find their lost ancestral connections. A friend of mine, an activist by the name of Isaiah, can bear witness to this effect. Washington once said that DNA has memory. Take note of that. This is so true. DNA has the memory that led me to the Jos Plateau in central Nigeria in my search for the Hausa people whom I shared a portion of my genetic ancestry with. This was exciting during the summer of 2000 and life-changing for myself and many others. DNA also had the memory that provided insight on ancestry for a group of African Americans who shared recent common ancestry in Cameroon. This memory inspired the group to go to Cameroon, sponsored by a non-profit organization called the Gemas, who helped foster personal and community ties between Cameroonians and African Americans. These are just a few examples of excitement and action that African Americans have shown once they have received DNA-based information on African ancestry. This is a start of what I believe the descendants of enslaved Africans need to do in order to heal as individuals, families, and communities from the experiences of the transatlantic slave trade. The guest of honor said, the emerging evidence suggests that people of African descent with disabilities are also among the victims of transatlantic, the Indian Ocean, and trans-Saharan slave trade in all aspects of their lives. But more systematic evidence is needed to fully understand how and why this has occurred. To this end, we have conducted narrative researches with a diverse group of 40 organizations of people of African descent with disabilities in Bangladesh, Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda, who are directly involved with community-based inclusive development programs. The use of narrative researches allows GPAN to document the life experience of people of African descent with disabilities. This methodology foregrounds the participants' priorities and perceptions, thereby allowing GPAN to explore their perspectives on what is needed to build on. They are the diaspora, disability policy, inclusive pathways to mitigate racial and social discrimination pandemics, effects on the people of African descent with disabilities all over the world. The first round of researches was conducted in July and August. The next round will be conducted in October and November 2023 to document the impact of the crisis on the lives of people of African descent with disabilities all over the world. The data gathered from the first round of researches will provide useful learning experiences of the impact of positive discrimination against people of African descent with disabilities. As such, we wanted to share our initial 3 key findings from each of the following countries before the more detailed analysis is published at a later stage. Number 1, Bangladesh. The people of African descent with disabilities in Bangladesh are still facing financial crisis due to the loss of their jobs, small businesses, their labor activities, and only sources of livelihood. The relief provided by their government to people of African descent with disabilities in Bangladesh is not sufficient, and their financial crisis means people of African descent with disabilities are not able to afford daily necessities such as food, medicine, and COVID-19 hygiene kits, which has led to domestic violence, depression, and stress. COVID-19 delayed the completion of their education in good time for people of African descent with disabilities seeking for employment, which hindered them from entering the job market. Job seekers also were not able to enter any new jobs due to the delay of recruitment processes, as well as the competitive job market. This creates an extra mental pressure on the potential job seekers. People of African descent with disabilities and mental health, their mental health deteriorated due to lack of access to health services especially for those needing various therapies, not being able to afford hygiene products needed to protect them from COVID-19, and the stress of the situation. Kenya. COVID-19 has exposed weak social protection programs in Kenya as people of African descent with disabilities required and expected support from their government, which was not being provided. They did not seem to want to heavily depend or rely on organizations for people of African descent with disabilities or non-governmental organizations, but instead they looked up to their government for support to provide them with social protection. They placed their responsibility of care on their government. To this end, lots of information about COVID-19 is not accessible, while the amount of information and misinformation makes it very scary and challenging to know where to go for the correct information. As in Bangladesh, the majority of people of African descent with disabilities work in the informal sector. Take note of that one. Informal sector. With heavy lockdowns and curfews imposed by their state, many have lost their sources of income, which increases stress levels and vulnerability. Nigeria. Loss of income was also a concern for people of African descent with disabilities in Nigeria. Government and non-governmental organizations were to relieve the impact of COVID-19 and did not factor people of African descent with disabilities in the form of provision of aid. People of African descent with disabilities who do not have access to technology and internet are particularly marginalized and segregated, as main employment or training opportunities favor or require virtual access platforms. Uganda. As in Kenya, information about COVID-19 is not always accessible in Uganda. This is especially the case in rural areas across the continent of Africa. During the pandemic, people of African descent with disabilities seem to have lost hope, especially those who were in the process of finalizing their studies or were job seekers when the pandemic or crisis had occurred. People of African descent with disabilities have to rely on charity to survive, which compromises on their dignity, individual autonomy, and independence. In addition, across the countries, there have been increased cases of gender-based violence and worsening mental health experienced by people of African descent with disabilities worldwide. The guest of honor, sir, allow me to belabor the Addis Ababa Conference of May 1962, which His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia convened a meeting of heads of African states and governments. In 3 days, take note of that one, the 32 nations represented at that conference demonstrated to the world that when the will and the determination exist, nations and peoples of diverse backgrounds can work and will work together in unity of purpose to the achievement of common goals and the assurance of that equality and brotherhood which all desire. But, take note of that one, but on the question of social and racial discrimination, the Addis Ababa Conference taught to those who will learn this further lesson, and I quote, until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally, take note of that, is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. I like that one. That until there are no longer first class and second class citizens of any nation, that until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes. That until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race or social status. That until that day, take note of that one, the dream of lasting peace and world citizenship and the rule of international morality will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. And ends my quote. The guest of honor, sir, it is important to recognize that disability is not homogeneous. And people of African descent with disabilities have faced different types of challenges during the heavy lockdowns and curfews imposed by certain countries all over the world. It is important to consider diversity of experiences. It is also not clear which of these impacts are specific and or more severe for people of African descent with disabilities compared with the impact on the rest of the population. The guest of honor, sir. The people descent with disabilities make up the world's largest minority group. They are disproportionately poor, are more likely to be unemployed, and have higher rates of mortality than the general population. All too often, they do not enjoy the full spectrum of civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights. Guest of honor, sir, please allow me to conclude by underscoring the fact that the observance of the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities in general has adversely failed to remind and commit the heads of African states and governments and the world at large to formulate attractive and sound economic policies that encourage civil societies, that neglect the integration of people of African descent with disabilities, that they deprive themselves of the valuable contributions such individuals make in society. And let us once again reaffirm our commitment to the equal rights of people of African descent with disabilities and to their full participation in the economic, social, and political lives of their societies. Finally, I wish to state that, underline that one, by the power and authority vested in me as the International Disability Special Rapporteur of people of African descent with disabilities, by the Global Pan-Africanism Network, GPAN, close bracket, I hereby declare 25th May every year as Africa International Day of People of African Descent with Disabilities all over the world in honor of the philosophy of Pan-Africanism as our ancestral pillar for Africa's struggle for freedom. And this will be observed and commemorated side by side with the Africa Freedom Day, which falls on May 25th every year, underpinned by the ratification of African Continental Free Trade Area, which dream has now become a reality. Long live Africa. Long live GPAN. Long live African diaspora. Long live the people of African descent with disabilities all over the world. I thank you. Africa Unite Green Campaign.